Snow was falling sideways that night, slashing across the glass walls of a mansion that glowed like a ghost above the frozen hills of Hudson Valley. Inside, billionaire Nathan Caldwell sat alone beside a dying fire, staring at the amber light as if it might burn through the silence. He had everything a man could own: power, wealth, a view of the world from above, but not the one thing that mattered: peace. The wind howled like a warning. Then came the sound that would change everything. A motion alarm from the service yard, the same one that never went off without reason. Ethan reached for his phone. The screen showed a blur of movement near the dumpsters. His security system labeled it animal, but something in the way the shape trembled made his chest tighten. He grabbed a flashlight, called for Atlas, his golden retriever, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit like knives. Snow swallowed the path the beam of his flashlight slicing through white chaos until it caught something small behind the dumpsters. Atlas barked sharply, tail-rigid. Ethan's heart kicked hard when the light landed on what looked like a bundle of rags half buried in snow. Then the rags moved. He ran the last 10 feet, boots sinking deep. Inside the half-open dumpster lay a little girl, no more than 7 wrists, zip-tied a strip of silver duct tape across her mouth, her face blue with cold. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. Ethan froze for half a second that felt like forever. Then instinct took over. He tore the tape away. Her lips were cracked blood at the corners. A whisper escaped her like smoke. "Please, don't let me die here." He ripped off his gloves and reached for her, cursing under his breath as he felt how cold her skin was. No pulse at first then, the faintest flicker under his thumb. Whoever had left her here hadn't expected her to see another sunrise. "Hang on, sweetheart. You're safe now," he muttered, voice raw against the storm. Atlas whined beside him, circling as snow whipped harder. Ethan pulled out his pocket knife, cut through the plastic ties, and wrapped the girl in his wool coat. She weighed almost nothing. He pressed her against his chest and started back through the snow, each step heavy breath burning his throat. Behind him, the dumpster lid slammed shut in the wind like the sound of a closing coffin. The mansion loomed through the storm, its windows glowing gold. By the time he reached the door, his hands were shaking so badly he dropped the key fob twice. He kicked the door open, heat rushing out to meet him. The girl's head lolled against his shoulder, her lips barely parting. "Come on, come on," he murmured, dropping to his knees on the marble floor. He laid her by the fire, rubbing her arms, trying to force life back into her small frame. Atlas blankets go. The dog dashed off and returned, dragging one from the couch. Ethan wrapped her tight, tearing off her wet dress and replacing it with layers of wool. Steam rose off her skin as the fire caught, painting the room in trembling orange light. He grabbed his phone, hit the number of Dr. Miranda Hayes. She answered half asleep. "Ethan, it's almost midnight." "I found a child," he said, voice breaking. "She's freezing, tied up, beaten. She's barely breathing." The doctor's tone sharpened instantly. "Listen to me. Don't rewarm her too fast. Focus on her chest and neck. Keep her still. If she's shivering, that's good. It means she's fighting." Ethan followed every word, his hands shaking as he rubbed warmth into her small fingers. Her lips moved again. "Don't let him find me." The words were barely sound. He leaned closer. Who but her eyes rolled back, her breath shallow and uneven. He pressed his palm to her heart. Still there, faint but steady. "You're safe now," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The fire crackled louder, shadows stretching across the marble like living things. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist, just the storm's roar, the dog's low whine, and the fragile pulse beneath his hand. Ethan had faced mergers worth billions, survived scandals that crushed reputations, but he'd never felt fear like this. Not for himself, for her. Hours passed in fragments. He fed the fire-switched blankets, whispered nonsense just to keep her anchored. When she finally stirred, her eyes, gray, glassy, terrified, found his. "You're safe," he said softly, raising both hands as if to show he meant no harm. She tried to speak, but pain twisted her features. He eased her down again. "Don't move. You're hurt." Atlas crept closer, resting his head near her arm. She flinched, then hesitated, then reached out tiny hand, trembling until her fingers touched the dog's fur. For the first time that night, her breathing slowed. Ethan sat back, exhaustion washing through him. The snow still hammered the windows, but inside there was a heartbeat, fragile and real. He had no idea who she was or what kind of hell she'd escaped, but he knew one thing: whoever had left her to die out there wasn't done. And for the first time in years, the man who thought he'd buried his own heart felt something break open again, something dangerous, something unstoppable. If you were standing in his place that night, hearing that child whisper for life in the dark, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments below, because this isn't just a rescue story. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about mercy, justice, and what a single night in a storm can awaken. Stay tuned, there's far more buried beneath this snow than anyone imagines. The morning after the storm felt unreal, the world outside Ethan Calloway's mansion covered in a heavy white silence. The wind had died, but the memory of its rage still haunted the air. Ethan sat beside the couch in his great room, the fire burning bright again. Wrapped in layers of blankets, the girl he had found lay motionless, her small chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Her wrists were red where the ties had cut deep, and her hair tangled and frostbitten framed a face too pale for her age. Dr. Miranda Hayes moved quietly around the room, her stethoscope cold against the child's skin. She had driven through the last of the storm to get there, her hair still wet with melted snow. "She's stable for now," she said softly. "Hypothermia, mild, frostbite, dehydration. She's been through something brutal." Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "She hasn't said a word since last night," he murmured. Miranda gave him a look that was part compassion, part warning. It might take time. Trauma like this, it buries everything until the mind feels safe enough to let it surface. The fire popped. The little girl stirred. Her eyes opened slowly gray as the winter sky darting across the ceiling before landing on him. She looked terrified. Ethan raised both hands a little, keeping his voice low. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe here." The words sounded clumsy even to him, but something in his tone made her hesitate. She tried to sit up but gasped in pain. Miranda placed a hand on her shoulder. "Easy, sweetheart. You're safe now." The girl's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at Ethan again, as if measuring whether he was real. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Clara." Ethan leaned forward. "Is that your name?" She gave a faint nod, eyes glistening. Miranda smiled gently. "Hi, Clara. You're very brave." But at the mention of her name, the girl flinched and turned her face toward the fire. Ethan could see it the way she shrank from light, from movement, from memory. He brought her a cup of warm milk, but her hands shook too much to hold it. He knelt beside her and steadied the cup as she sipped. "Do you remember where you came from?" he asked softly. Her gaze went distant, frightened. The man she said, he said, "I had to be quiet, or he'd come back." Her small voice cracked on the last word, and the cup trembled in his grip. Miranda gave Ethan a look that said, "Enough, don't push her now." When Miranda stepped out to take a call, Ethan stayed by the fire. Clara's eyes followed the flames, mesmerized, then wandered to a painting above the mantel, a winter bridge over the Hudson River. Her lips parted. "That's where he took me," she said faintly. Ethan froze. "This bridge." She nodded, hugging the blanket closer around her. It was dark. There were trucks, He said no one would find me there. Ethan's pulse quickened. Do you remember what he looked like? She shook her head. I only saw his coat. It smelled like gasoline. She started to tremble again, and Ethan quickly shifted the focus. It's okay. You don't have to talk about it now. But inside his mind was already racing Hudson Bridge gasoline trucks. Whoever had done this wasn't a random monster. This was planned. Hours passed. Miranda returned with a tray of soup, insisting Clara eat a few bites before she rested again. As the doctor packed her things, she turned to Ethan. I'll file a confidential report, but we need to be careful. If she's part of something bigger, someone might come looking. Ethan nodded grimly. Then we'll be ready. Miranda studied him for a moment. You've changed since I last saw you, she said quietly. You used to avoid anything that reminded you of loss. He glanced at the girl sleeping under the firelight. Maybe that's what makes this different. I'm done avoiding. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in the study security footage looping on the large screen. He paused, frame by frame, searching for anything beyond the blur of snow. Then a faint-shaped human crossed the far edge of the property fence. A flash of a vehicle's taillights. He magnified the image until the pixels broke apart. A white van, no plates, one rear door dented. His heart pounded. He printed the still and pinned it above his desk. Down the hall, a faint cry pierced the silence. Ethan hurried back to the living room. Clara was sitting upright, drenched in sweat, eyes wide in terror. He's coming, she gasped. He found me. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, gripping her shoulders. Hey, look at me. You're safe. No one's coming here. Atlas patted over, resting his head on her lap, a living anchor. The trembling in her body slowed. She clung to the dog's fur, whispering, He always comes back. Ethan felt a sharp ache in his chest. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that rewires a person from the inside. When she finally fell asleep again, Ethan stayed there, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. Outside, snow began to fall again, quieter this time, like the world was catching its breath. Miranda's words echoed in his mind. If she's part of something bigger. He looked at the van photo on his phone, then at the child asleep under his roof. Whoever had left her to die had made a mistake, a fatal one. The man who once hid from the world was gone. In his place was someone who couldn't look away anymore. He whispered more to the empty room than to himself. I'll find out who did this. Atlas lifted his head ears, twitching as if he understood. And in that silent house on the hill, Ethan Calloway began to feel something unfamiliar purpose. He didn't yet know that the small girl in his care would drag him into a darkness far older and colder than the storm outside. But for now, there was only one promise he could keep: she would never be alone again. By morning, the storm had quieted, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the snow itself. The sky hung low and gray over the Hudson Valley, and every sound, the creak of the trees, the distant hum of plows, felt too sharp, too alive. Ethan Calloway stood by the frosted window, a mug of untouched coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the line of tire tracks that cut across his driveway and vanished into the woods. He hadn't noticed them before. They didn't belong to his staff. Someone had been here. Dr. Miranda Hayes arrived just after 9, her hair pulled back, a folder under one arm. She looked rested, but the moment she saw Ethan's expression, her voice dropped. What is it? He handed her his tablet. The security footage showed the faint outline of a vehicle moving along the back fence around 3 a.m. White van, he said quietly. No headlights, no plates. She frowned, zooming in. You think it's the same person who left her? Ethan nodded. I don't think. I know. In the living room, Clara sat on the couch. Atlas curled beside her like a golden wall of safety. The child was drawing with a trembling hand a bridge, a van, and a dark figure beside it. Ethan watched her from the doorway. She didn't look up, but her voice was small, certain. "That's him." Miranda glanced at Ethan. She remembers more than she's saying. "You should talk to Detective Alan Morse. He owes me a favor." By afternoon, the detective arrived, a tall man with graying hair and a calm that came from years of chasing monsters who hid in plain sight. He listened without interrupting while Ethan replayed the footage. When it ended, Morse leaned back. "White van unmarked. That's a classic mover's rig. Too common to trace without more detail. But the pattern fits." He opened his notebook. "We've had reports of similar abductions, kids taken from foster homes, shelters, hospitals. They vanish, paperwork goes missing, and no one asks questions because the files say, 'relocated.'" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're saying this is organized?" Morse nodded grimly. "And whoever dumped that girl on your property made a mistake. These people don't leave evidence. They dispose of it." That night, the air inside the mansion felt charged, the kind of quiet that listens back. Ethan upgraded every lock, every camera, every motion sensor. Clara followed him through the hallways, silent but alert, clutching the stuffed bear Miranda had brought her. When he knelt to fix a sensor near the back door, she whispered, "He's looking for me." Ethan looked up, meeting her gray eyes. "He won't find you here," he said, "I promise." But even as he said it, a part of him knew promises had to be protected, not just spoken. At 11:27 p.m., the first motion alert pinged on his phone. He froze, eyes flicking to the screen. The feed looped once, then went dark. Power glitch, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. Atlas growled low, the sound vibrating through the hardwood floor. Ethan moved quietly to the console, switching to the backup generator feed. The monitors flickered back on static, then snow, then black. A single word flashed across the main display, "Found." He grabbed his flashlight and the revolver he kept locked in the desk. Miranda was asleep in the guest wing, Clara in the room next to hers. He crept down the back corridor toward the service door. The cold air leaking through the frame carried a faint metallic scent, burnt fuel and engine oil. Outside, the yard was empty, blanketed in white. He opened the door slowly, his breath clouding the air. The wind hissed through the trees. For a moment he thought he imagined it the crunch of footsteps. Then came another, closer. Atlas lunged forward, barking so hard it shook the glass. Ethan spun the flashlight beam across the snow. A figure in a dark coat darted toward the woods, leaving only a smear of shadow. He fired once into the air, warning, but the sound only echoed back unanswered. When he reached the edge of the clearing, there was nothing but wind, and the faint trace of a boot print leading to the trees. He crouched, touched the snow. Still warm. Whoever it was had been there seconds ago. Inside, Miranda met him, halfway down the hall, hair disheveled, voice shaking. "What happened?" "Someone was out there," he said. "They cut the feed." She looked past him toward the windows. "They're not afraid to come back." "They should be," he muttered. When he returned to check the door, he noticed something wedged in the latch. A piece of dark fabric, torn, damp, smelling faintly of cologne and smoke. He held it under the light. The pattern was strange. A small embossed insignia stitched near the seam, IRFF. Miranda studied it, brow furrowed. "What does it stand for?" Ethan stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Reed Foster Foundation. It's a private foster network. They sponsor half the children's programs in the state." Miranda's voice hardened. "If they're behind this," Ethan cut her off, "then I'll burn them to the ground." At dawn, Detective Morse returned with 2 officers to sweep the property. They found more footprints, 2 sets this time leading toward the woods. They tested your defenses, Morse said quietly. Next time, they won't just look. Ethan watched the girl sleep on the couch, her tiny hand resting on Atlas's paw. The thought of anyone touching her again twisted his stomach. Then next time, he said, they'll find me waiting. That evening, he installed a direct link to the county police feed, doubled the perimeter sensors, and armed every window. Clara stayed close, her quiet presence filling the house with a strange mix of fear and trust. When the sun went down, she asked him one question that cut through all his resolve. Why are you helping me? He hesitated, the answer simple but painful. Because someone should have helped you sooner. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, silent, deceptive. But Ethan Calloway no longer saw snow the way he used to. Somewhere out there in that endless white were people who thought a child's life could disappear without consequence, and he was going to prove them wrong. They found the small things first, the mundane, almost ridiculous details that betray how carefully someone tried to hide a crime. A receipt tucked into a trash bag outside a shuttered warehouse. A single, erased line item on a contractor's invoice. A courier manifest with an altered pickup time. Detective Alan Morse put them on the table in Ethan Calloway's study like a kind of evidence quilt, bits and pieces that sewn together traced a route. Reed Foster Foundation appeared again and again, not loudly, just enough to show pattern. Ethan stared at the letters and felt the room tilt. Miranda Hayes had been working a different arc. In the hospital where she still held privileges, she'd pushed through red tape to follow one fragile lead, a misfiled intake form. A social worker had recorded a discharge with the wrong name 2 winters ago. The file label said, transfer out of state. In the margins, someone had scrawled a destination code and the initials RFF. For someone who'd lost so much, the bureaucratic cruelty of it hit home the polite phrase, transfer, hiding the jolt of a human being folded into a paper flow. Miranda sat in Ethan's kitchen that night and read the sequence aloud. They used the system, she said. Not to help kids, but to make sure no one looked twice. They moved from paper to phones. Morse subpoenaed call records and began to map the network. It was painstaking granular work, burner phones, staggered numbers, SIM cards swapped at truck stops, a ring of logistics emails routed through shell domains. A pattern emerged, payments routed through a non-profit ARM invoices issued by shell companies with names like Northern Transport Services or Harbor Logistics. Each transaction was small enough to drift under the radar, but repeated the spool grew long and thick. Ethan watched a line of dates click into place and felt a dull, cold certainty. This was not a one-off. It was a system. The more they peeled, the more the architecture of that system revealed itself. Notaries who appeared on multiple documents. Municipal clerks who had been retired suddenly around the time records went missing. A document processing firm in Boston that handled what looked like routine transfers but left no digital trail. It was a patchwork of plausible deniability. The kind of structure that when you exposed one seam revealed another. Ethan realized hard and fast that civil paperwork could be weaponized. The idea made him angrier than he expected. He had fought corporate sharks his whole adult life, but this felt different. This was predation disguised as charity. Evelyn Foster's recovery was its own small war. When they found her, she was skeletal and disoriented, the kind of silence around her that comes when someone has learned to stop asking for things. She could not always remember dates. She scraped through images, flashes of a woman with a clipboard. A van idling at night, a fluorescent-lit room where forms were signed and names changed. Her memory came in shards. When she sat with Clara now, the daughter's small hand clinging to hers like an anchor, Evelyn would close her eyes and try to piece together the rest. They said it was for education, she told Ethan once, voice papery with disbelief. They said it would be better. I signed. The thing that made Evelyn's account so dangerous was how ordinary it sounded. So ordinary it had been accepted by the very system meant to protect children. Ethan started using the instruments he knew: money trails, access to databases, quiet leverage with a judge. He did it with the careful reluctance of a man who'd learned the cost of power. He didn't want to trample. He wanted to suffocate the network. He convinced a magistrate to grant an emergency preservation order, freeze key accounts, seize archived emails, force server logs from the cloud providers. It read like a bureaucratic weapon, but it worked. The first freeze produced panic in their opponents. Money slowed, transfers stalled. That rustling in the dark had a sound, something like someone learning there's no safety net. Jonathan Reed did not respond to summons like a man who feared prosecution, at least not at first. His profile was larger-than-life philanthropist, board member, trusted donor. He had buildings with his name on them. He had been the kind of man who sold solace in exchange for capital, and for years his philanthropy had masked his business dealings. Ethan remembered Reed as the kind of investor who asked for favors while smiling. Now, Reed's smile felt like a threat. Ethan called him to a meeting under the guise of civil mediation. It was a controlled environment, a room with cameras, a judge on standby. Ethan never liked the theater of entrapment, but the alternative was letting the network swallow more children. When Reed arrived, he wore the precise armor of the untouchable tailored suit, open, confident thing. He moved through the living room like a man who owned public trust. He offered condolences, the practiced performance of men who buy respect in donations and speeches. Ethan listened until Reed produced a stack of documents. He leafed through notarized papers and Guardian transfer forms so pristine they might have been printed the day before. Ethan watched Reed's hand, watching for the tiny betrayals of hubris. Then he slid a compact recorder across the table, the kind no one would notice at a fundraiser. He pressed play. A voice, smooth, pragmatic, outlined logistics as if they were meeting agenda items, routes to avoid the tone for inspectors, how to phrase paperwork to reduce the chance of review. The voice was not the voice of a background operator. It was a voice that set policy and budget. When it said, "We run the transfers and we keep the paperwork tidy," the room changed. Reed's face did not crack immediately. The veneer was thick, but the flinch was small and human. He reached for the folder like a man searching for a shield and found only paper. The recording shifted the game. Morse moved with the swift, patient force of a seasoned investigator. He coordinated raids with state agents and a federal task force. Executives at shell companies were interviewed. Servers were seized. Notaries were compelled to testify about signatures they had witnessed. Reed's connection sputtered as phone numbers were subpoenaed and bank accounts frozen. It became clear that Reed's operations had been built to exploit the gaps of oversight and the appetite of well-meaning institutions for low-cost transfers. Public life is a delicate thing. Reed's image, smiling in charitable galas, speaking at panels, unraveled as journalists, tipped by a sympathetic whistleblower, at a document processing firm published the first of many exposés. The headlines were clinical and devastating. Philanthropist under scrutiny, nonprofit transfers, under investigation, children traced after records found. For parents who read those headlines, outrage was immediate. For those who understood how small repeated corruption can devour trust, it was a slow, burning grief. They found more children. One raid on a storage facility outside state lines turned up crates of children's clothing stamped with false name tags, a manifest of transfer dates, and most heartbreakingly a pile of scribbled drawings that matched several missing kids' styles. Each discovery made the work urgent in a new way. It turned the case from a legal puzzle into a rescue mission. Ethan, who once believed solitude could temper responsibility, spent nights on the phone coordinating with social workers, offering his foundation's resources for immediate care and placement. Miranda organized immediate medical evaluations. Detective Morse kept a list of victims he read like names that could not be forgotten. Evelyn's testimony was small but crucial. She could not remember every date, but she described a pattern: someone in a gray coat who spoke soothingly, a van that smelled of diesel, a clipboard, and the way the people who came to take the children looked at her like they were doing her a favor. Her voice when she spoke in court trembled, but carried a truth that paper could not disguise: the weight of being convinced something horrible was actually help. When Reed was finally arrested, it was at his estate, the place where he had given speeches about care and community. The contrast between cause and consequence was sharp and public. He protested, of course. Lawyers filed motions, PR teams spun narratives. But the evidence had teeth: bank transfers, recorded conversations, notary records. The freeze on accounts and the search warrants made it impossible for the network to function undetected. That victory did not feel like brief fireworks. It felt like a long, slow exhale. The children found were not instantly whole. Trauma is not a wound that a badge or a bank can heal overnight. But the net that had swallowed families was cut. For Clara, who spent mornings drawing bridges and vans; for Evelyn, who clung to her daughter as if she would dissolve without contact, there was the beginning of a new Axis safety. For Ethan, there was an awakening of something that looked like purpose and obligation braided together. He had entered the night a man rescuing a single child. He left a man who had pulled a thread and refused to let the fabric fall apart. They had exposed the truth beneath the ice, bureaucratic, banal, terrifying. And once it was exposed, it could be fought. The first day after the arrests felt strange, almost unreal. Snow still blanketed the Hudson Valley, but it no longer felt suffocating. It glistened now, clean and bright beneath the sun. The sirens were gone, the headlines relentless, and the silence that returned to Ethan Calloway's villa wasn't empty. It was earned. Inside, the smell of coffee and firewood filled the air. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor with Atlas at her side, crayons scattered around her. Evelyn watched from the couch, her color returning, her voice soft, as she read from a children's book she hadn't held in years. Miranda Hayes poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one by Ethan's hand. For the first time in months, his shoulders weren't drawn tight. On the mantel above the fire sat a framed photograph. Clara asleep against Atlas, Evelyn's hand resting on her daughter's hair. Ethan didn't remember when Miranda had taken it, only that when she'd handed him the print, she'd said, "You should keep proof of what good looks like." It was the kind of simple thing that lingered. Outside, reporters camped at the end of the long driveway chasing sound bites. He ignored them all. The story had already made its way to every major outlet: philanthropy exposed as child trafficking front, arrests tied to Reed Foster Foundation. Each headline came with a photograph of Jonathan Reed in handcuffs, that familiar confident smile replaced with something hollow. But none of the articles captured what had happened inside those walls: the fear, the sleepless nights, the vow, whispered over a half-frozen child in a blizzard. Detective Alan Morse stopped by that afternoon. He looked tired, his overcoat heavy with thawed snow. "It's over," he said, voice low, as if still testing the truth of it. "Federal charges are filed. Dozens of kids are being moved to real homes. You did more than save one life, Ethan." Ethan nodded, the words slow to land. "You ever notice," he said, "how quiet it gets after a storm breaks, like the world's waiting to see what we'll do with the silence?" Morse smiled faintly. "Then, I'd say, fill it with something worth keeping." As the days passed, life reshaped itself in small, steady ways. Evelyn began physical therapy, her laughter starting to sound less fragile. Miranda stayed often helping Clara adjust, teaching her how to name feelings she'd spent too long hiding. The girl began sleeping through the night. The nightmares didn't vanish completely, but they softened, replaced by dreams she could talk about. She drew every morning bridges, snowflakes, houses with light spilling from every window. Each drawing was a kind of declaration she was still here. Ethan didn't return to work. His assistants flooded him with updates, and investors called demanding clarity. He gave none. The empire could run without him. The world could wait. He had started something else, something smaller, harder, truer. The Callaway Foundation, renamed quietly and deliberately, shifted its focus overnight. What had once been a portfolio of art grants and environmental causes was now an engine for reform legal defense for abused minors, funding for investigative journalists, emergency shelters in under-policed counties. He worked with Morse and Miranda to create a task unit, part nonprofit, part investigative hub, a place where no case could go missing. One evening in late February, Clara asked him why he kept the coat he'd found her in. It hung near the entryway, cleaned but scarred at the seams. He thought for a long time before answering. "Because it reminds me what cold feels like," he said, "and how it feels when it finally ends." She seemed to understand. That night, she drew a picture of a man standing in snow with a little girl beside him, both holding a lantern. She titled it, "The Night We Didn't Freeze." Ethan framed it the next morning. The official hearing came weeks later in a downtown courtroom that smelled of varnish and paper. Reed's lawyers spoke in measured tones about misunderstandings, legal oversight, procedural missteps. But the evidence spoke louder: ledgers, phone calls, witnesses, and the voices of parents and children whose lives had been sold through forged paperwork. Evelyn testified last. Her words were quiet but devastating. "I signed because I was told it meant safety," she said. "But safety isn't something you sign. It's something people protect." There was no applause when the verdict came down. Just relief, the long aching kind that follows a wound finally closed. That night, Ethan drove back to Silver Pine Villa through a light flurry that didn't feel like threat anymore. Inside, Clara and Evelyn had decorated the house with paper stars and candles. Atlas trotted to the door, tail wagging a ribbon still looped around his collar from Clara's latest ceremony. She called it the end of the storm. Miranda was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, laughing as Clara insisted on frosting cookies shaped like snowflakes. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, letting the sound of their laughter sink into him. The kind of sound you don't realize you miss until you have it again. Later, after Clara fell asleep on the couch, he stood by the window watching the snow drift under the porch light. Evelyn joined him quietly, her steps slow but steady. "You kept your promise," she said. He shook his head, eyes on the horizon. "We all did." Outside, the night was still and forgiving, the world blanketed in white, not the white of isolation, but of renewal. As dawn broke over the mountains, sunlight touched the lake, turning ice to gold. The storm at last had stopped, not just outside, but inside each of them. And though the scars of winter would remain, they had learned something enduring. Even in the coldest night, a single act of mercy can start the thaw. In the end, Ethan Callaway's journey was never just about rescuing a little girl from a snow-covered dumpster. It was about rescuing himself from a life built on walls. What began as a single act of compassion in a storm became a reckoning that changed everything. Through Clara's courage and Evelyn's survival, Ethan learned that true strength isn't found in power, but in the willingness to protect the powerless. The cold world outside his villa had mirrored the emptiness inside him. Saving them melted both. The empire he once built for pride became a foundation for justice, a promise that no child would be lost to silence again. The lesson is timeless. Kindness is not weakness. It is the quiet rebellion that restores humanity. In a world that often rewards distance and indifference, one person's decision to care can shift the course of many lives. Like Ethan, we all face moments when it's easier to look away, but choosing compassion is how we thaw the ice around us and in others. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel and share it forward. Your support helps us keep bringing more powerful soul-stirring stories that remind the world goodness still exists, and it begins with you.